I watched Zardoz again. At the end, I still had no idea what to say about it. I was tempted to read what other people have made of it, hoping that it would spark a coherent response, but I caught myself. No, I need to sort this out on my own. Finally, I came to the conclusion that Zardoz doesn't make sense because Zardoz is the 70s. Shiny, colorful kitsch smeared over despair in a society that has created the conditions for its own destruction. It gives us elite-centered environmental concerns coupled with a fear of population growth tied together by a loathing of humanity, as though the Club of Rome were script consultants.
The world was dying. We took all that was good and made an oasis here. We few, the rich, the powerful, the clever, cut ourselves off to guard the knowledge and treasures of civilization as the world plunged into a dark age.
It proceeds to show us a compressed future that's strangely familiar, not factually, but as a broad emotional allegory. Every institution is based on a lie. The emasculated ruling class quibbles over minutiae and distracts itself with tedious decadence.
This place is built on lies and suffering. How could you do what you did to us?
They keep the rabble in check by arming a bunch of nutjob proxies on a murder crusade far beyond their borders, and lose their minds when it shows up in their own lands. And finally, their own policies of repression, coupled with their collective self-loathing and the machinations of one of their own corrupt elites, leads to their slaughter at the hands of a barbarous horde that they unwittingly crafted and armed for that very purpose. Looking back on it, Zardoz is less a fever dream apocalyptic dystopia by a director drunk on his own success, and more an eerily prescient psychedelic parody of the world that was just coming into being. So, a quick rundown. Zardoz, this floating stone Karl Marx Santa Claus looking thing, is a fake god created by this bouncing head with a mustache drawn on his face. He's not really a floating head, but the mustache really is drawn on. Because Zardoz, that's why. The fake god Zardoz, as in Wizard of Oz, hates humanity.
The penis shoots seeds and makes new life to poison the earth with a plague of men, as once it was. But the gun shoots death and purifies the earth of the filth of brutals.
His faithful are murderous, doty-wearing wastelanders, and their faith is rewarded with a shower of small arms barfed forth from the depths of Rocky Santa's gullet. Sean Connery plays Zed, a raping, murdering zealot of the Zardoz cult. He's the hero of the story. It's a dystopia, remember? He hitches a ride in the Angry Stone Head and arrives at Vortex 4, a town populated by foppish immortals. Having conquered death 300 years prior, they spend their immortality having long lunches and being petty twaddlers. They're bored, you see. They don't know what to do with themselves. Some of them are so bored that they have become what the others call the apathetics. They just stand around, staring off into the distance like meat mannequins. But one of these undying clowns, Arthur Frayne, who apparently can't grow a mustache but really wants one, has a plan to give his people what they really want. Death. Placed in charge of the outlands because no one else wanted to be bothered with the savage areas where all the food comes from.
He told you to take prisoners.
Yes.
To make slaves.
Yes.
To cultivate instead of kill.
Yes.
To grow wheat.
Yes!
Did you need wheat?
No, we ate meat. Zardoz betrayed us. We were hunters, not farmers.
His plan includes Zed's ride in the Zardoz noggin, and when he's discovered in Vortex 4, they all have a good laugh, toying with the primitive screwhead, sort of Brave New World style. But it turns out Zed isn't some ignorant savage after all, but part of a carefully constructed plan to bring down the shield protecting Vortex 4, destroy the supercomputer that keeps reconstructing its inhabitants, and let the murderous horde of mass savages in to slaughter the supposed immortals. I find Zardoz interesting, not for its story, but for the elements that it tries to craft a story from. The immortals descend into apathy and suicide not because they're immortal per se, but because they live in a stagnant society. There's no new blood, no new ideas, no sense of wonder or drive to innovate. They're bored not because they're immortal, but because they're boring. But they also represent the logical end state of the zero-growth society advocated at the time by organizations like the Club of Rome, and reflecting the core ideas of some environmentalists and transhumanists today.
Think about equilibrium. Remember the delicate balance we must maintain.
So, some background. The Club of Rome, a gaggle of industrialists, scientists, and government officials, published a report in 1972 called The Limits to Growth. They fed population growth numbers, energy usage, and a bunch of environmental data and projections into a computer model, and from it presented a series of possible futures based on what action was taken between then and the early 21st century.
It shows that simply cleaning up our car exhausts and making some small effort to limit our families simply isn't enough.
It's highly politicized, with critics and true believers alike misrepresenting it to this day. But the important point here is that its conclusions were based on the assumption that the Earth is a closed system with a fixed carrying capacity, and that their forecasts of energy use, population growth, etc. were anything more than linear extrapolation, without taking into account that ecology and economies are dynamic systems. Super condensed summary of its conclusion: people need to use less, or there needs to be fewer people. This builds on ideas about the environment and population growth that were popularized in the 60s. For example, through books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which went so far as to make specific dated predictions, all of which have proven to be laughably wrong. This sense of catastrophism around possible future problems and technocratic thinking in addressing them was floating through the culture by the mid-70s, and much of it is reflected in Zardoz, to the point that the film almost feels like a satirical critique of the whole movement. I've never seen any comment by the director that this was the intent, but he has also said that he smoked a lot of pot while working on it, so who can really say what he meant? If we look at the Society of the Immortals through this lens of ideas of simplifying lifestyles and zero population growth, they look like the goal. They live in a quaint village with no real industry, no pollution. They're in no danger of overpopulation, they never have children, and no one dies. Perfect zero-growth balance. The 70s also had the early growth of the modern transhumanist movement, the idea that humanity will transform itself into something else through its own knowledge and technology. The details differ wildly, but some common trends are life extension and technological augmentation, up to potentially uploading consciousness into a machine, which strikes me as comically presumptuous when we can't even measure consciousness in any quantifiable way. But it's implied in Zardoz that they can do that. Arthur falls to his death in the wilderness only to be regenerated later. The film explains that people are regrown when they die and shows us a glimpse of the process, implying that the consciousness and memories are backed up somehow.
Is Arthur Frane's memory transmission still functioning?
Arthur Frane ceased transmission 3 days ago. Arthur Frane died. Reconstruction has begun.
The Immortals are a transhumanist zero-growth society. More simply, they're an anti-human society, both in their exploitation of the outside and their own self-loathing and longing for death. They've lost their strength, both physically and in their desire to learn and to better themselves. But the real dystopian aspect is that there's nothing to look forward to. The Immortal Society is a tedious bore, but their fall doesn't spark a renaissance or reform. There's no great statesmen, philosophers, or engineers left to rebuild. Only slaughter by illiterate warlords and presumably a dark age with no end in sight. Zardoz is a tale of mankind's sad, whimpering decline from traveling between the stars to societal decomposition, and finally collapse to pre-technological feudal thuggery, if not simple gang war. There's a profound pessimism and despair at the core of it. It's stagflation and a lost and useless war wrapped in bright colors and shiny objects. But even the most depressing dystopian visions usually end with some sense of hope, even if subtle. Even Orwell's 1984 begins its appendices with the words "Newspeak was," implying that at some point the oppressive regime and its works fell. The hope at the end of Zardoz is simply bringing back options, flipping the table and starting over. It's an acknowledgement that sometimes the worst-case scenario, the real apocalypse, is the status quo continuing to its logical conclusion of stagnation and permanent misery. Zed's rebellion is essentially saying, yeah, war in a dark age sounds awful, but it's better than leaving you lot in control forever. I'm just gonna back away.